It smelled of lime and wet wood. Ropes were being stretched across the square for new prohibitive announcements, and the remains of the day before yesterday's limbing were souring in barrels near the well. The council servants were in a hurry, because there was already whispering in the taverns about new punishments for intimacy, while in the hospital courtyards they couldn't keep up with carrying away basins of dark water. The townspeople scattered from the carts with straw mats, on which they carried those who had been selling flour or sewing boots in the morning, but by evening could no longer lift their heads. At this hour, the loudest sound was not the bells or the prayer choirs, but the dull splash of the sewage ditches flowing into the moat behind the wall. Friends, greetings. Your narrator is here. Please write in the comments which city and country you are watching this analysis from. It is important for me to understand the geography of our audience. Make yourselves comfortable, take care of your nerves, and enjoy listening. The city in question was ruled by a ruler from a family that loved order and accountability. In the summer of 1630, Tuscany was ruled by a sovereign from the Medici family, and the officials of his office took as much pride in their tables and inventories as they did in their marble carvings. The magistrate of health had seals, forms, prescriptions, and guard chains on the gates. But when 3 workers at the freight yard died in succession at the beginning of the hot season, the council gathered and decided to strike not at the canals, not at the masonry around the wells, not at the market with its piles of animal entrails, but at night, at beds and bodies. Decrees were issued on abstinence, punishment for debauchery in homes, the closure of bathhouses until further notice, and permission for patrols to watch over modesty. The papers were littered with the word sin, which had previously been much less common in sanitary regulations than words such as cracks, stains, and rats. The doctor, who is mentioned in the appointment book and in letters to the office, was a man of harsh manners but a strict accountant. He recorded which of the neighbors carried water, where, how often underground wells were opened in the alley near the market rows, when carts with lime arrived, and on which day after the rain the first cough appeared in the weaver's quarter. There was no drama or righteous anger in his notes, just a series of marks and the names of the adult population: yarn sellers, porters, craftsmen, widows with stalls. He drew a rough map by hand on a scrap of parchment. Thick lines represented ditches, dots represented houses where someone had been laid out on a board during the week, and circles represented places where women sat by the water with buckets and washed laundry brought from the government chambers. At first, the map looked like a simple puzzle of narrow streets. But by the end of the second week, it became clear that the chains of deaths stretched along the same ditch, and that every time the night watch forced the shopkeepers to close their shutters and disperse the couples, the same puddle of black water remained near the rented accommodation on the corner. The council sat by the marble wall with a list of debtors to the city treasury. According to the charter adopted by the fathers of the current elders, the costs of cleaning the ditches and deepening the canals were to be financed from trade levies collected on the days when salt, bread, and wine were brought in. But according to the books, the fines for the summer will amount to more than 100 coins, given to the guards and clerks of the moral patrols. At the beginning of the epidemic, these sums still seem insignificant, but by the middle of the month, cold decrees and accompanying fines become the main source of income, and workers who in previous years were hired to clean ditches are now told that there is no allocation yet. The Porters Guild complains that their people are weakening from carrying barrels of lime, but there are no orders for cleaning out cesspools. The Bathhouse Workers Guild, which in better years was entrusted with disinfecting the bathhouses, now stands with its entrance locked, their chairman's palms cracked from idle days and dirty work under supervision. The doctor brings 2 tables to the magistrate's court. The first is a list of courtyards where 2 or more adult residents have died in the last 4 weeks. The second is the dates of the modesty patrols and the amounts that were collected from residents on those days for allegedly violating the newly prescribed abstinence. He brings no emotion. He brings correlations. The more patrols in the neighborhood, the less the night brigade of water carriers works, and the denser the marks on the map become. By evening, when the office clerk stamps the document, several elders whisper with the guard at the gate. In the correspondence, preserved in sheets scattered throughout the archives, there are broken phrases about confusion with the sanitation fund. At first, it seems like routine. Offices always argue about who is responsible for what. But then simple and unpleasant arithmetic begins to emerge. It is easier to collect fines in the silence of the night patrol than to drag carts full of dirt, pay the crews, and risk the stench that will give you a sore throat for a week. Meanwhile, the city lives as best it can. Behind the icon painters' stalls, old women sell red and black threads to tie around the wrist for good health, pressing closer to the wall when a cart with sheets rushes by. At the gate where grain is delivered, horseflies appear, and it is noticeable that the guard with a hook is too lazy to close the gap in the dam, through which warm water flows from the ditches between the stones. In the state chambers, where the sick lie, the junior servants hold basins full of gray moisture and complain to each other that this month they were given less money for lime than for new rods for the walkers. The charter of the Bath Guild recounted how, in the previous generation, a master from another duchy came to the city to teach how to treat doors with sulfuric smoke. Now all this is forgotten because the bath is closed until better times. The locks on the doors are covered with a whitish coating, and the window sills in the empty changing rooms are sprinkled with dust, as if that is how it should be. Every day of such emptiness is another day when people wash their clothes in the ditch. The doctor, who sees all this, does not take on the pose of a prophet. He goes to the clerk of the penalty book, asks for an extract, and is met with a wall of polite silence. Everyone in the city is an adult, and everyone understands that the city's budget has suddenly become tighter. Last year, a certain amount was spent on disinfecting street cleaners, and this year, less, but more, was spent on purchasing raincoats for the guards and paying for additional night shifts. If you unfold the receipt stubs, you can see the names of the same families that are already marked as vulnerable on the doctor's map. The poor, tenants, widows, members of guilds without orders. They pay for morals, but all they have left is a common ditch as a source of water and a place for drainage. To move the conversation from the realm of rumor to that of documentation, the doctor conducts a simple experiment. He chooses a point on the map where the stream of an open drainage ditch crosses the path to the well. He asks 3 adult neighbors who are members of the Butchers' Guild and 2 porters who are members of the Porters' Brotherhood to move the boards so that the open drain is blocked overnight. The next morning, women gather near the well with broken dishes, and there is an uproar. But by evening, not a single new mark appears in the notebook of the rector of the Treasury Chambers for this neighborhood. 3 days later, the experiment is repeated in another place, and again there is silence in the daily death table. When the blocked drain is opened a week later, the marks return. It is not a mystery or witchcraft. It is dirty water, pleasing to rats and fleas, and the laziness of those who were supposed to order dredging this month, but did not want to touch the cash register. The doctor compiles the experiment reports, adds a list of witnesses, adult guild members who are accustomed to keeping their word, and submits a note to the health magistrate. At this point, the story shifts from city bustle to fear. The elders gather for a meeting and see uncomfortable lines before them. Places, dates, names, the effect of blocking the drain. It is clear to them that simple decrees and modesty patrols have not changed the death curve. They also realize that on paper, the city looked like a model guardian of morality, but in reality, it was cutting corners on dirty and invisible work. Admitting a mistake means explaining why the money went elsewhere. And the money was linked to people close to the gatekeeper and to one of the senior officials in the office who signed the monthly reports. The doctor has no evidence of direct gain, but the Treasury's balance sheet speaks for itself. Revenue from fines has increased exponentially. Sanitation costs have fallen. Hospital wards are overcrowded, and decrees about beds are posted on every corner. To drive the point home, the doctor adds maps to the protocols, with zoning by smell and color of the water. His students walked around the neighborhoods, recording where the stench lingered longer and where it disappeared by noon. Combined with the wind patterns from an old sailor's logbook, this gives an even clearer picture. The infection does not come from bedrooms or festivities, but from the side where the ditch intersects with the washing and draining area of the tannery and spreads through the streets, where teenagers, who run faster than adults and stumble more often, spilling water on the doorsteps, are entrusted with carrying water. Adults who try to stay away from these places still have to go for water and bring it to the rooms where the sick lie by the wall. This is the terrible truth of city life. It is easy to ban beds because they are visible, loud, and convenient for calculating fines. It is difficult to cover the ditch because it is underground, with stench and hassle, without applause. By this time, the Bricklayers Guild has joined the case. Its senior member brings the magistrate a list of works that in previous years were paid for from the Cleanliness Fund: lining ditches with stone, checking dampers, replacing rotten floors. He shows that this year, these items have been stolen from the city in silence. When his list is combined with the book of fines, a diagram emerges that sends a chill through the room. In the weeks when the fight for modesty was particularly active, sanitation work was reduced to zero. Not because all efforts were directed toward fighting the epidemic, but because a small group of adult men found a convenient way to pretend to protect morals while accumulating influence over neighborhoods that had no way to respond. The myth that sin is the cause of disease obscured the simple need for masonry, clean water, and a team that would not be afraid to climb into a foul-smelling trench. In the city courtyard, people whisper that one of the elders has a relative who runs an office that arranges night patrols. This is no longer a matter for sacred words, but a matter for accounting. The doctor does not write accusations. He brings new reports, which detail by day, on which day the ditch was blocked, on which day the number of deaths in the neighborhood stopped, and as soon as the damper was put back in place, the mortality rate rose. On the fifth day, a note is submitted about the areas where the cracks need to be filled with clay and wooden wedges driven in, as well as a proposal to temporarily redirect some of the clean water from the monastery garden to the two wells, where the queue stood until noon. This measure seems inappropriate because there is a labyrinth of old canals under the monastery garden, and they are guarded, but the sanitary regulations allow for action in an emergency. The health magistrate cautiously agrees to a week-long trial. On the seventh day, adult men from the Brotherhood of Porters carry heavy logs and clay to the coveted cracks, and the night ends without the ringing of the bell from the Treasury chamber. At this moment, the story takes its first clear turn. It is not a moral cry, but a wooden wedge that saves the courtyards. The protocol is laconic: blockage, lull, opening, deterioration, blockage, improvement. Behind the dry lines lies the wet, hard work of people who did not read theological treatises, but knew how to lay a board so that it would not bend. And then there is the dispassionate map, where the circles of death fade, where the leaks have been stopped. The elders now look not at posters with the abstinence charter, but at the places where they will have to answer for the signatures they have been putting off week after week. To publicly admit that the money went to patrols and not to ditches is to sign one's own political defeat. But to deny the graphs is to watch as the list of daily deaths grows longer. Meanwhile, adult life in the city is changing imperceptibly but decisively. The habit of moving the straw mat from the wall closer to the window for the night breeze is giving way to the habit of keeping a jug of well water by the door and washing hands where they used to be wiped on the curtain. Bath attendants, who are required by statute to store herbal and lime solutions, open one of the rooms exclusively for washing the laundry of those who care for the sick. They are admitted according to special lists and are supervised not by a guard, but by a senior medical student who checks that the water has been brought to a boil. This is not a spectacle for the patrol. It is a routine with no audience. In the tanner's quarter, a temporary wooden grate is placed across the moat to prevent boys from jumping over it. And this, too, changes the course of the pencil lines on the map of deaths. The elders' resistance is based on fear. No one wants to be the one to sign the repeal of the cold decrees and admit that they were poor substitutes for real hard work. But the documents are slowly shifting the battlefield. The doctor brings a comparison. Where moral bypasses were in effect without simultaneous sanitary work, the curve did not fall. Where sanitation was in place, the curve broke downward. A myth against paper is being built. In the sermons retold by the chronicler, the familiar refrain is heard: weakness of the body leads to punishment. Abstinence leads to protection. On the magistrate's health sheets are lists of expenses for dredging, purchasing lime, hiring crews, and next to them is the decline in the number of new cases. There is no compromise between these two systems. Either continue to find the beds or close the ditches. The first part of this story ends not with the public execution of the guilty parties or mass repentance, but with a gathering of people at the city wall, where they unfold a map copied from the doctor's notes into a fair copy, with neatly drawn districts, moats, and dates. The map has red circles around the areas where drains were opened 3 days before the spike in deaths. Next to them, neat numbers are written out in full, showing the amounts spent on patrols and the amounts that didn't make it to the bricklayers and bath attendants. The elders cannot argue with lines and circles. They understand that next time, the people in the square will not be looking at their staffs, but at these dates and amounts. And on this evening, in the silence of the office, where the shelf smells of mold and candle smoke, the clerk finally makes a note that will open the second turn: an order for the temporary reallocation of money from moral bypasses to cleaning and gap-closing brigades, as well as a trial removal of bedding decrees in 2 neighborhoods, where the map had already shown that sanitation was stronger than the fear of bedding. The entry about the reallocation of funds looked dull, like most clerical lines, but that same evening, the people and objects on which the life of the neighborhoods depended began to move. Rusty shovels, long unused, were taken out of storage. Barrels of clay and baskets of wood chips were delivered to the Bricklayers' Guild warehouse, and a list of adult brigade members responsible for covering the gaps appeared at the gate where the porters were on duty. The order did not contain any grand words, only dates, sections, the names of the masters, and a mark indicating the payment to be made from the city treasury. At night, while the modesty inspectors continued to take roll call on paper, 2 bricklayers and 3 loaders opened the floor above the ditch near the tannery, laid rotten boards, hammered in wedges, and mixed lime into the clay to hold back the flow. By morning, the water had drained into a closed underground passage, leaving a wet strip on the surface that did not reach the wings of the houses. The doctor noted the new lull in his appointment book. The Treasury Chamber had not accepted anyone in this quarter. The next day, the same operation was carried out at the dam downstream, where in previous weeks there had been queues of women with jugs. The map faded again in the right places. But the change did not please those who had recently gained power through fear. The gatekeeper, whose men made nightly rounds, brought a paper to the magistrate arguing that sanitation work was a long and thankless task, whereas moral supervision worked quickly, maintained public obedience, and had an educational effect. These arguments smacked of a habit of justifying invisible income, and they were written in such a way as to hide the main point. Not a single patrol changed the flow of sewage. Not a single beating in a tavern plugged a hole in the ditch. In response, the office was flooded with reports. The columns listed the costs of lime, hiring crews, delivering logs, and repairing sluice gates. Next to them was data from the Treasury Chamber on daily mortality, where after each sanitary night there was a visible decline in spikes. The elders looked gloomily at these lines. Before their eyes was the myth of obedience as protection, and at hand was a document that spoke not of feelings, but of the density of the flow. While the adults in the hall measured each other's signatures with their eyes, the city continued to change in small ways. The bath attendants removed one lock from the back door and began to let in those who cared for the sick, allowing them to wash their laundry in boiling water and roll the stretchers with solutions that were kept in a locked cabinet, according to the rules. The guards, who had become accustomed to checking beds over the past few weeks, now walked around with a confused feeling, because the order contained a direct instruction not to interfere with the work of the bathhouse guild, and not to detain adult women at the water if they were going to the stoves with marked buckets. In the markets, merchants began to lift sacks, not directly from the pavement, but from wooden stands, so that the dirt, saturated with sewage splashes, would not mix with the grain. The doctor, taking advantage of the cold, rational chill that helps to get things done in a city where people are used to putting up with stench, introduced another table. Boiling time, frequency of water changes, number of sheets processed. There was nothing spectacular about it, but after a few days it became clear that the houses that followed this order were no longer included in his map with circles. The first serious blow to the resistance came not from the office, but from the monastery garden, where secret irrigation channels dating back a generation stretched out. Irrigation, established under the previous abbot, was under the supervision of the spiritual authorities according to the charter, and the city authorities were reluctant to interfere. The doctor sent a student there with a list of adult witnesses and dates, proving that the temporary diversion of water to 2 wells reduced the load on the neighborhoods near the market. The abbot, accustomed to the measured shade of his alleys, feared that the city would take the water without giving anything in return, and then leave it at that, citing the disaster. The papers went back and forth between necessity and caution. The sanitary magistrate referred to the state of emergency, the monastery's bursar to its statutory rights. In the 3rd week, when rumors had already spread throughout the city that mortality had fallen in 2 neighborhoods, while outbreaks still persisted on the outskirts, a compromise was reached. A temporary dam would be installed on strictly specified days, and the city would compensate the monastery for part of the lost harvest from the state grain reserve. In the documents, it looked like a column of numbers, but in fact, it was a second turning point. The institution, bristling with its charter, entered into a deal based on numbers, not out of fear of abstract punishment. From that moment on, the elders' fear was replaced by another danger: the danger of publicity. At the beginning of the summer, the money went to the rounds, and by the middle of the summer, to the sanitary brigades. The papers preserved this, and those who signed the first orders did not want their names to be associated with the weak when they handed out rods instead of shovels. To save face, they tried to play on people's fears. Stories began to spread in the city that boiling water supposedly dries up strength and destroys tissue, and that baths spread weakness. These words were recorded by the chronicler, and they reflected a habit of explaining misfortune in invisible moral terms. But there were documents against them: the Charter of the Bathhouse Guild, which listed the herbs and solutions permitted for use, city regulations requiring every neighborhood to keep barrels of lime, and a magistrate's report detailing the daily decline in the number of people falling ill in places where boiling and isolating dirty water had become the norm. Thus, a second line of myth against documents spread throughout the city, where the document ceased to be a dry formality and became an instrument of survival. The gatekeeper, not giving up, proposed the old order in a milder form. "Let the patrols remain," he said, "because cultivated fear is convenient for controlling the crowd." At this proposal, the elders of the guilds gathered in the evening. Their interest was specific. It had become easier to work in the city, where one did not have to wade ankle-deep in the darkness flowing over the stones. The Porter brothers, grown men, no longer walked in circles between the beds and the ditch. Now their brigades were called in for sanitary nights and paid from the treasury. The bath attendants got their jobs back, and the masons once again received their estimated expenses. At the meeting, it was not slogans that were heard, but lines from books, excerpts from penalty journals, where it was clear how, in certain weeks, education replaced work. Prescriptions from the past decade, where the city authorities had already explained that foul-smelling cracks were a common enemy. This was the third prepared turn. The workshops, whose economic fate was linked to sanitation, intervened in the dispute, and brought their heavy word in the form of stamps and expense lines. Meanwhile, the disease did not let up completely during the summer. Chains of deaths still flared up in remote neighborhoods, and each time the doctor and his students checked to see if an old sewer had been opened somewhere during the night, if the ditch had overflowed into the alley, or if secret drains had started from the workshops. Several times they found that behind the dark gates, leather workers had arranged a drain so as not to pay for removal. This was no longer about luck or myth. It was about an adult's choice between saving a few pennies and someone else's life. In such cases, the city did not arrange public floggings because no one wanted to turn the struggle for the bottom into a spectacle. They wrote up reports, blocked the drains, fined the workshop, and assigned a team with barrels of lime to it for a week. When these episodes were mapped out, it became clear that each such unauthorized drain caused an outbreak 2 days later in the nearest houses where day laborers lived. Their names appeared more often than others on the lists of the Treasury Chamber, which once again confirmed what the doctor had repeated in his notes. The disease spreads through water and dirt, not through the night edges of the sheet. By autumn, the magistrate of health had decided on a step that had seemed unthinkable in the spring: the abolition of bedding decrees throughout the city. The paper, written dryly and clearly with caution, stated that the previous measures had not had the expected effect and could distract from the main issue. Alongside this was an order to close the remaining open ditches, to inspect the sluice gates around the entire perimeter, and to expand the use of boiled water in public hospitals and in homes where the sick were cared for. For adult citizens, this did not mean relief from moral pressure, which was already exhausting, but rather a clear and heavy schedule of work for each quarter: where to cut clay, where to lay boards, where to dig a trench. At the gates, they stopped selling thread for superstitious ribbons, and nearby they began to distribute cheap jugs for boiling, purchased in bulk from a neighboring town. The accounting books showed expenses for the pottery workshop, which had nearly closed in the spring, but now received a large order. Thus, sanitation became not only a form of protection, but also an economic driver. The city paid those who did visible work. At this point, the elders decided to get their own back through formality. They tried to rewrite history to make it seem as if it was their moral observance that had prepared the discipline that allowed the sanitary measures to work. The chronicler cautiously inserted phrases about restoring public order, as if people were incapable of obeying before boiling water and sealing cracks. This was contradicted by documents that could not be flatteringly rewritten. Experiment reports showing that sealing cracks had a clear effect. Tables comparing expenses and mortality rates. Statutes directly prescribing measures developed in advance during previous waves of the disease. The physician and his students completed a large compendium to which they attached maps, records, and lists of autumn work. This compendium was submitted to the sanitary magistrate for approval, and a simple and solemn phrase was added on a separate sheet stating that bed rest was not a medical measure and should not be used as a substitute for sanitary measures. The paper was not a manifesto. It was a guide to action. The city itself was surprised at how quickly the queues at the public hospital disappeared after each big sanitary night. Not all troubles disappeared, but the dull helplessness disappeared when posture was offered instead of action. Adult women, who had been carrying water and burning their hands on stoves for months, were given the right to enter the bathhouse according to lists without rude shouts, because now their labor was considered part of the general charter. Adult men from the workshops stopped hiding from night patrols, because the patrols moved from the bedroom to the moat. An unusual discipline of numbers intensified in the city. Room conversations gave way to records, and the doctor's apprentice learned to write down dates without hasty notes, as a clerk in a penalty book does. Thus the myths, familiar and comforting to those who fed on the fear of others, gave way to paper, where meaning spread across the lines. Pain does not ask for moral judgments. It comes through water, through mud, through ditches, and goes away to the same place where the crack was covered. When, at the end of autumn, a new list of work for the winter was posted on the city wall, the first item was to inspect the dampers and check that all the gaps around the perimeter were closed. The second item was to maintain boiled water in the state chambers and to provide coal and jugs to those houses where the sick were lying. The third item was the restoration of the Bathhouse Guild's work in accordance with the charter, with thorough disinfection and admission, according to lists compiled jointly by medical students and senior members of the Porters' Brotherhood. The fourth point looked like a modest line about ending the modesty patrols, but its price was enormous. The city acknowledged, albeit indirectly, that last summer had been lived under the angle of misguided priorities. It was not repentance. It was a human decision, squeezed out of paper facts and hard work. And on the day when the last wooden frame was placed over the moat and the last wedges were driven in, empty circles remained on the doctor's map, a reminder of the price the city had paid for someone else's confidence, that fear and posture could stop the flow. Winter did not bring relief in itself. It only slowed the smell and muffled the splashing of the ditches under the fragile crust of ice that cracked under the porter's boots. Where the closures held, the neighborhoods were quieter, but the outer streets adjacent to the tanneries and slaughterhouses beyond the wall continued to ache before the furnaces had time to cool. The doctor spread the map wider, including the suburbs and areas along the old riverbed, where sewage was driven so that the city would not see its own waste. He linked the dates of funerals from parish records with the schedules of the sluice gates and obtained a simple line. As soon as the gray streams flowed into the open ravine, 2 days later, adult day laborers and widows from the cheapest houses appeared on the funeral lists. His student, trained in the fall to sign his name neatly, compared this with the cost of delivering logs. When the carts left for the outer moat, the inner floors remained unreplenished and began to shake. In the nettles near the taverns, you could hear the water flowing, and this music, which was drowned out by the markets in summer, sounded clearer than any bell in winter. By January, the magistrate's office had begun auditing the cash register. After the autumn reorientation of funds, there were shortfalls, and they had to be called by their proper names. The clerks put all the orders for night patrols issued last summer in one column, actual receipts to the sanitation fund in the second, and the amounts promised to bricklayers and bath attendants in previous years, according to the charter, in the third. The resulting equation could not be ignored. At the Duke's court, solemn decrees on caring for subjects had been signed in the fall, but in the city, the seals were stamped on papers where modesty replaced work. When these columns were placed on the table before the elders, for the first time they did not try to hide behind theological phrases, and asked, not with words, but with the movement of a pen, who specifically should be held responsible for the summer imbalances. The doctor did not name names. He brought another map, where the paths along which adult women carried water to their homes were marked with graphite lines, and these lines showed how pointless it was to ban beds if the route to the jug ran along an open crack. The Tanners' Guild faced difficult weeks ahead. Their elders objected not out of stubbornness, but out of fear of losing customers. If the drainage ditches were blocked, they would have to pay for waste disposal, which would affect the prices of belts, jackets, and shoes, and the city, where grain had already become more expensive, would respond with empty store shelves. They brought their documentation to the office, contracts with carters, estimates for processing hides, lists of adult workers who soaked their hands in solutions in the cold, and returned home with cracked skin on their palms. These papers did not justify anyone, but they provided a tool for an honest deal. The city agreed to temporarily compensate part of the costs of removing dirty water, provided that the tanners submitted reports with marks from the sanitation teams. The workshop's charter included a clause prohibiting any nighttime discharges under threat of confiscation of equipment for a period long enough for the neighbors to notice. It was a compromise born not of lofty words, but of a shared weariness with the winter funeral lists, where the names of laborers and craftsmen from the same neighborhood appeared side by side. At the same time, the doctor contacted a notary who kept marriage and property records. The contracts themselves, of course, did not contain any medical information, but they did contain tiny details of city life, conditions for the right to use the courtyard well, the owner's obligation to ventilate the basement, and a ban on keeping vessels with foul-smelling liquids under the stairs. These deeds built an invisible bridge from the private to the public. If the contract stated that adult residents had the right to clean water or access to a bathhouse according to the charter, then refusal to provide sanitation was not an internal family matter, but a violation of conditions protected by seal. The elders did not argue with the notaries because they knew the value of the seal. Thus, the myth that sin breeds disease collided with the line about ventilation grills and the right of passage to the street tap, and the myth had to retreat. The lime wagon was a whole week late, and this nearly disrupted the winter work schedule. The doctor made a small note in the book. The city's dependence on a single road is equal to the body's dependence on a single uncovered seam. The magistrate calculated that if part of the state warehouse was reserved for lime and boards once a month, and the distribution was carried out not at the request of the guilds, but according to the sanitary inspection schedule, there would be no need to wait for favorable weather in the spring. It seemed boring, but it gave power to the lists, not to moods. In the pottery workshop, which barely survived on the sale of jugs, they raised the kilns and switched to batch firing to meet the new city order for boiling vessels. Money from the treasury went where empty columns had previously stood. Thus, the caprice of educational rounds was replaced by simple distribution. Barrels here, jugs there, wedges there. Guard duty, not at the bedside, but at the damper. Adult porters began to receive payment not for endless roll calls at night, but for specific movements of the flaps and for carrying heavy frames. Their palms no longer smelled only of wet straw from the guardhouse. They smelled of resin, clay, and lime. In the spring, in the neighborhood, in the port, where the old infirmary, once modeled on Venetian institutions, was located, the results of the winter were announced. The quarantine warehouses had survived 2 outbreaks of disease, and both times the infection was contained not by vows and lists of penitents, but by separate streams of water and careful isolation. The doctor brought a copy of their report to the magistrate, which clearly described how wooden boxes were built at the junction of the canals to prevent dirty water from mixing with drinking water, and how a team of adult porters was kept on constant rotation at a series of sluice gates. This experience resonated particularly clearly in our city, because there was no room for delays in the infirmary. Every delay turned into a new list of funerals. The elders saw that the neighboring charter, though foreign, spoke the same language as their winter records. This became the 4th prepared reversal. The institutional memory of a foreign city lay on the table next to the local estimates and confirmed that there was only one way forward: water and sluice gates, not beds and red tape. By May, dangerous voices had returned. Some of the preachers, who found it easier to explain everything with the softness of the flesh than with sewage geometry, wanted to bring back words to the square that were convenient for gathering crowds. Phrases about the need for a double fence, spiritual and carnal, seeped into the chronicle. And this fence suspiciously resembled the previous cold decrees. The doctor did not argue in holy terms. He brought a collection not even of tables, but of human stories, recorded dryly. An adult porter, who worked on the sluice gates, fell ill during the period when a team of tanners secretly opened the drain and recovered after the drain was closed. An adult laundress, who cared for the sick, did not fall ill when boiling water was used as a disciplinary measure, but her neighbor, whose husband saved on firewood and washed his hands in the same place where the tanning belts were soaked, did fall ill. These stories brought the conversation back down to earth, because it was impossible to raise a stick against them. There was no guilt in them, only causality. At the meeting where the issue of a complete and irrevocable rejection of bed decrees was decided, what had been feared since winter happened. Correspondence between the gatekeeper and the senior clerk of the Moral Rounds cashier's office was revealed. Several letters were written hastily and almost without embellishment, and they contained harsh arithmetic. How many rods? How many rounds? How much was collected? How much was underpaid for such and such weeks? The discovery did not come as a shock to the city. Everyone had seen how the money was being moved during the winter, but it did undermine the security of the old excuses. Formally, no crime was found because the paper was cautious, but the moral weight of these lines was enough to prevent the elders from hiding behind talk of education any longer. The point was made not by shame, but by fear of a repeat of the scheme. When the decision was formalized, a solemn, almost silent celebration began in the city. The bathhouse charter was returned without theological additions, only with reinforced sanitary articles. The sequence of boiling, the amount of lime per week, the order of admission of adult caregivers, the right of the guild to close the doors to any interference not provided for in the charter. The bricklayer's workshop received a plan for the entire season, strengthening the troughs, replacing rotten frames, cutting new drains in the monastery garden while preserving property rights, as agreed in winter. The porters signed a schedule of night sanitary shifts every other day, without moral reconnaissance. The pottery workshop was working at full capacity, and in the square where posters about abstinence used to hang, a list of places where you could get a jug for free in exchange for a voucher from the treasury chambers was now displayed, if an adult in the house was caring for a sick person. Meanwhile, the question of fairness to those who had paid fines in the summer arose. The treasury did not have enough money to refund everything, and no one wanted direct payments that would name specific culprits. So the city again found a way out through paperwork. Part of the advances for future work was distributed to those guilds whose members most often appeared on the summer lists of fines, and a line appeared in the charter of the small claims court about the right to demand compensation from workshops caught in secret nighttime discharges, in favor of adult neighbors whose homes were included in the doctor's map within 3 days after the offense. It was a dirty but fair mechanism. It was not an abstract pocket that paid for the habit of hiding waste, but those who saved on other people's breath. In several cases, such compensation was granted quickly, because the doctor's records and the records of the treasury chambers coincided, and the testimony of the guild elders was considered sufficient for a decision. By summer, the city had not turned into a textbook example, but it had changed fundamentally. The road to water ceased to be a road to disease where closures were maintained, and became dangerous again where the floodgates were opened at night. The myth that the preachers tried to capture faded not from ridicule, but from routine statistics printed in small print in office books. Adults who had previously gritted their teeth under the whip of educational patrols now went to night brigades with that special feeling when they do a job that will bring less praise and more hardship, but which will leave empty circles on the map of deaths. The doctor, not allowing himself any satisfaction, added new sections to the book, observing how the behavior of water changes in the heat, how quickly puddles dry under the wall, how many barrels of lime are needed per block for the hottest day. He did not let words outrun facts. He simply continued to compile an appendix to one large instruction manual, which the city had already begun to read without fear. The threat had not disappeared. It had become manageable. The main change was not in replacing one poster with another, but in the fact that the city had come to terms with the inconvenience of the truth. Disease comes through sewers, through cracks, through buckets, and not through the myth of beds. To acknowledge this meant accepting the dirtiness of the work, the cost breakdown, and the dependence on the labor of others. The hand that had previously signed off on the moral bypass now confidently signed off on the write-offs and payments to the crews. And in this confidence one could hear the experience of winter, when the cold stopped the leak, but did not remove the cause. When rumors of a new outbreak on the outskirts began to spread once again, the doctor's map showed not chaos, but two dark nodes, near the old ravine and near the workshops, where plums were hidden in the evening. That's where the crews went. That's where the clay jugs went. That's where the cart with boards arrived. Whispers of abstinence died away under the creaking of a wooden frame, which 3 adult men drove into the damp earth with a wedge, so that the water would turn in the right direction. And the more the city did such quiet, difficult things, the clearer it became. A document without myth saves. A myth without a document feeds someone else's fear and someone else's coffers. When the ropes for announcements were raised again in the square in the fall of the new year, there was not a word about beds in the list of orders. There were dates for the autumn inspection of the sluice gates. There was an instruction to keep a reserve of coal and lime in the state chambers. There were new tariffs for the removal of tanning waste, with provisions for fines for nighttime discharges, and the right of the Bathhouse Guild to close its doors to outside interference. Contrary to the sanitary regulations was enshrined. This list was not accompanied by preaching, but by the signatures of the elders, the magistrate of health, the guilds, and the notary responsible for the formulas of the rite of passage to water. A damp, slightly smoky cloth swayed slowly above the rope, and beneath it walked adults who had been chased away by night patrols the previous year. They now saw how their city was learning to speak not loudly, but precisely. And in this precise language was the main thing. If it is necessary to choose where to go, to the bedroom or to the damper, the city chooses the damper. In the spring of the following year, the main concern was not the return of penalty slips, but the water that had risen after prolonged rains. It overflowed its usual bed at the old dam, and in a single day revealed what the city had diligently ignored for the past century. Under the floorboards in several neighborhoods, there were secret bypass channels dug by generations of craftsmen to speed up drainage during fair seasons. These bypasses worked as a convenient valve for private needs as long as there were few of them and someone was watching the gates. But the spring pressure cut off the clay wedges, and black slits came to light, through which the sewage sludge went to where every seam had already been polished with clay in winter. The doctor and his students marked the new, dark tracks on the map, and it became clear that the disease was now spreading not according to the old patterns, but along an arc connecting the hiding places of craftsmen, who were accustomed to saving on waste disposal, with a cluster of cheap houses near the market. This surge did not refute the lessons of autumn and winter. It demanded that they be carried through to the end, not just to close the gaps that were visible, but to find all those that had been driven into the body of the city by foreign crowbars many years ago and remove them, root and branch. The health magistrate compiled lists of suspicious places, and for the first time, these lists included not only ditches, but also the subfloors of private workshops, where old sockets for boards gaped in the stone. The adults from the Porters' Guild, accustomed to night shifts, now worked during the day under the supervision of masons, removing rotten frames and sprinkling lime into the pits, from which sour vapors still rose. The Duke's Court responded to the spring alarm in a way that the city feared, but had long expected. It sent an auditor, a man whose eyes were accustomed to seeing more in numbers than in stories. By order of the sovereign, he was to check how the city had spent its money over the last 2 summers and 1 winter, and most importantly, why more had been spent on morale than on sanitation in 1 season, and how it had all ended. This visit was the 5th prepared reversal, not because someone had uncovered a conspiracy, but because a cold, foreign accounting office had placed the city's tables side by side with a report from a hospital in a neighboring duchy, where similar measures had yielded similar results. The auditor was not interested in other people's excuses. He demanded pure figures: how much lime had been purchased, how many frames had been replaced, how many jugs had been issued, how many times the gates in the monastery garden had been closed, how many weeks the decline had lasted in those quarters where sanitation was proceeding according to schedule. He made it clear that bed decrees were considered useless and harmful to the treasury because they diverted resources from real work. His silent presence took away the elders' last argument about the educational effect. Now it was no longer a dispute about morality, but a matter of the rational use of ducats. The doctor handed the auditor his charts, records, and experiment reports. They clearly showed a cause and effect relationship that could not be ignored. Where the gap was closed, the circles were white. Where it was open, they were dark. The spring flood revealed another slippery thread. The parish funeral books contained the names of adult women who washed laundry near several hidden drains at the state granaries. These drains were previously considered temporary, They were opened on delivery days and closed when there was time, but no one wrote down when. Now, a clause was added to the barn guard's charter about the personal responsibility of the caretaker for each opening and closing of the sluice gate, with a signature and date, and a line was added to the expense book about regular disinfection of the drain on those days. It looked like a minor clerical routine, but it was precisely this that put an end to the habit of leaving the problem to take its course. In a parallel column, there was an expense for tiny wooden plaques with slots for stamps, which were nailed to each valve. No stamp meant a fine, no date meant a violation of the charter, no signature meant dismissal. The document became visible on the tree, and this visibility could not be bypassed at night without leaving a trace. Resistance to the old moral order did not disappear. It dissolved into numbers like salt in hot water. A number of preachers continued to link the surges to the softness of the flesh, but the auditor looked at the wind map and the drainage schedule that the doctor had compiled in winter, and realized a simple thing. The peaks in deaths coincided not with the calendar of feasts and weddings, but with the calendar of open drains and damper blockages. He did not argue about the language of temptation. He started a new record where the dates and times of damper openings were on one axis, and the registrations of admissions to the state hospitals were on the other, with the signatures of those responsible in between. When this ledger was hung on the wall of the office, it looked like a boring columnar fence, but the adults who came for coal coupons saw their winter in it. Where the line was straight, the house was quiet. Where it broke, someone did not get up 2 days later. Adults did not need extra words. They needed a clear, smooth surface of order on which to place a jug without fear that a black gap would open up under it again. The summer heat, which came early, tested the city a second time. On the outer rampart, where the tanners' carts were hidden in the shade, illegal dumps were found 2 evenings in a row. These were not boys with buckets, but adult craftsmen, from the workshop list, trying to save money on transportation after the price of charcoal rose. They were caught not with a whip, but with paper. The plates on the dampers had empty fields where the stamps should have been, and this was enough to confiscate the tools for the period specified in the new addition to the charter. Neighboring shops realized that convenient dumping was turning into easy evidence, and for the first time in many years, sanitation crews did not hear whispers of, "Let us have a night shift." This did not please those who were used to living on the edge of the rules, but many admitted that it was easier to breathe at dawn, when the market was still empty, and the hot air did not carry the gray smell throughout the neighborhood. The doctor accompanied this period with a new watercolor chart. At the same time of day, students collected samples from key points and noted shades ranging from transparent to cloudy yellow. In those neighborhoods where the colors stabilized closer to light, relapses disappeared. It seemed like a primitive scale, but it was exactly what the city needed, where decisions are made by people with rough palms. Observing the developments, the Duke's Court took a step that was whispered about in the city, but without satisfaction. It approved the Water Charter, a separate set of rules derived from sanitary regulations. It put the rights of adult residents to access wells, the obligation of workshop owners to keep records of waste, the responsibility of barn guards, the priority of the bath guild in emergency situations, and the key principle that expenses for invisible work come before expenses for visible work, all on the same level. This principle sounded almost like heresy to those who were accustomed to justifying themselves with public detours. But after 2 years of drama, it had a foundation in tables and maps. The chronicler, who recorded all this, cautiously noted that for the first time in living memory, the city had printed an order that did not mention carnal sin as the cause of disease, but mentioned dirty water as a factor in its transmission. This was more frightening than any execution because it deprived the old rhetoric of its last refuge. During those same weeks, the health magistrate rolled out another quiet innovation: a home hygiene journal for households where adults cared for the sick. It was not a police document, but a memo with simple points written in large print. Boil water for at least as long as it takes for small bubbles to evaporate completely. Keep a separate jug by the door, and do not dip the ladles used in the kitchen into it. Wash your hands where fabrics are not washed. Keep shoes at the threshold. Wash the bedding of the sick in the bathhouse according to lists. Ventilate after each boiling for at least a certain number of minutes. These lines were without emotion and without the stalactites of lofty words, but they contained human logic from which the courtyards were saved. Adults were made to sign, not for punishment, but so that there would be no arguments in the kitchens about what was more important: steam from the boiler or whispers in taverns. The doctor attached a brief collection of observations to this journal, explaining in simple terms why hands need hot water, why a jug by the door is not superstition, why a wooden frame on the damper is not a whim, but the boundary between silence and the funeral list. His pragmatic voice shaped a new language for the city, the language of things and sequences. The most stubborn supporters of the bed decrees made a last attempt to bring back the past through a side passage. They proposed to call everything that was happening teaching modesty through cleanliness in order to leave room for the old hierarchy. But the water regulations and a bundle of sanitary cards left them no room for maneuver. Now any turn to words without action was blocked by 2 or 3 paper boards: the act of responsibility for the dampers, the list of expenses for lime and frames, the record of boiling and bath shifts. When, at one of the meetings, one of the elders tried to link modesty with the successes of sanitation, the chairman of the Bricklayers Guild put lists of shifts with the names of adults who pulled frames in the rain on the table and quietly shifted the conversation from the clouds to the wedges. This was not a public humiliation, but a return of power to those who saved the city, not at the walls, but beneath them. And from that moment on, the myth finally receded to the margins of the chronicle, like an old headline that was no longer needed. The finale did not come with fanfare. It came as a series of human decisions that formed a new order. The former patrolman, who had been accustomed to marking doors with chalk the previous summer, joined the sanitation brigade and stopped knocking on walls at night. He now placed wedges at the shutters and was paid not for frightened glances, but for drying puddles. The gatekeeper remained at his post, but his patrol book was now a list of closures on the ramparts, not a route through the bedrooms. The potter, who owed money to his firewood suppliers in winter, paid off his debt with a city order for jugs, and wrote in his book today what he had not written for many years. The stoves worked without stopping. A middle-aged bath attendant who worked on the nursing lists no longer hid her hands, covered with burns from boiling water, because the state hospital gave her ointments and charcoal on schedule, and her work was referred to in the charter as sanitary service rather than women's duty. A leatherworker foreman who had been caught twice dumping waste at night bought back his confiscated presses from the Treasury, signing a new line in the charter and paying for the removal for the first time, because abstract fear no longer helped, and the specific fine hit his wallet hard on the days when the water supply was shared. When, at the end of the second summer, the auditor presented the Duke with a report that did not contain a single line about bedtime decrees, but only sums, lists, graphs, and maps, the court approved the final abolition of all moral papers concerning abstinence during days of illness. The decree was accompanied by a dry explanation. The measures distract the Treasury and people from sanitary activities and do not lead to a reduction in mortality. The city did not meet this with booze and carried sacred objects. Here they simply knew the value of each signature. On the wall where a poster about modesty had hung a year ago, there was now something else. A map of shutters with colored marks indicating inspections and dates of planned closures. Passers-by saw in it neither beauty nor threat, but the breadth of their courtyard. The more evenly spaced the marks, the quieter it was at the doors of the Treasury chamber. And this simple omen became a new folk wisdom, in which there was no room for the old horror stories. History did not justify anyone who hid behind loud words, nor did it punish anyone with public censure. It made the air visible, water accounted for, labor paid, and documents stronger than myths. The city did not become holy. It remained tired from summer to summer and winter to winter. But it learned to choose work over posturing. The grown men and women who carried jugs, boards, lime, and maps for 2 years did something that rarely makes it into the annals. They decided the outcome without spectacle, only through a sequence of actions. And when, once again at dawn, the warm wind from the market carried not a sour smell, but the simple smell of flour, the doctor put his card in the cupboard, not as a trophy, but as a tool that would be taken out again tomorrow. It was not happiness or triumph. It was clarity. You cannot scare away illness. You can only ward it off. And the decrees that invaded the bed and did not close the cracks remained where they belonged, in the footnotes to the big book of city mistakes, which no one wants to reread. The summer, marked by the repeal of cold decrees and the adoption of the water charter, seemed as solid as a new frame on a damper. But beneath it, old habits continued to pulsate, the very ones that make a city a city. Behind the market, where heavy wheels rolled over the stone in the mornings, stood the grain storage sheds, and there, among the sacks, where the flour smelled of dry warmth, the remnants of the old economy were hidden. Someone was still diverting gray water into the underground so as not to pay for its removal. The doctor did not make a tragedy out of this. He opened another folder containing his students' observations on the color and viscosity of the water at different thresholds, and again, without offense, showed the simple truth. 2 days after the secret discharge, the neighboring courtyards were added to the list of the Treasury Chamber. The auditor, who remained in the city until autumn by order of the Duke, had an unflappable method. Each episode became a line in a summary report, where the dates, the names of the adults responsible, and the condition of the water were listed side by side. When this statement was placed on the table of the elders at the end of the month, it looked like a forest of thin columns. But behind each column stood a life, a difficult, silent life, without rituals, but with consequences. It became clear that the new order was not based on a one-time decision from above, but on the repetition of actions: close, boil, take away, sign, check. Those who used to walk into the dark passageway with a bucket now knew that a trace would remain on the sign, and a trace was not a shout or a shameful display, but a deduction from their wallet and an extra day of inspection for the workshop. To strengthen the backbone of change, the Magistrate of Health proposed what seemed like boring paperwork, but was in fact the nerve center of the new order: an annual water census. Not of people, not of houses, but specifically of water. This census included wells with approximate daily jug capacity, crevices and frames with inspection frequency, sections of ditches with depth and flow velocity, laundry areas with admission schedules, as well as coal and lime reserves for each quarter as of the beginning of the hot season. The doctor compiled a preface to this collection in which, drawing on his own and others' experiences, he explained why a jug at the door is as much a part of the city's defense as a guard at the gate, and a boiling kettle is as much a tool as a barrier at an intersection. There was no passion in the preface, only memories arranged in orderly paragraphs. How last winter, an unsigned barn door caused a surge of funerals in cheap houses, how the spring flood opened up old bypass channels, dug not out of malice, but out of hope of avoiding the disposal fee, how the bathhouse, closed under the slogan of modesty, became a place of salvation when boiling and herbal solutions were returned to the charter. This document was accepted silently because it glorified no one and shamed no one in the square. It simply explained where myth ends and reality begins. During those weeks, the city faced another smooth and elusive danger: heat that dried up puddles faster than people could reach the well. Heat itself does not bring disease, but it changes the behavior of water. From deep stone pots, the water carrier takes out not cold transparency, but a warm, cloudy mass, which lazy hands carry more slowly, leaving wet streaks along the way, where flies like to sit. The doctor sent his students along routes where, in summer, courtyards stretch toward springs, and asked them to note not only the color of the water, but also the smell at the doors, the size of the dark marks on the stone, and the frequency of spills. This boring geography led to another simple conclusion. Where jugs stood at the very thresholds and hands were washed on the spot, rather than in a common basin, the chains of infection were broken. In places where adults walked from afar with half a bucket and were too lazy to boil the water because it was stuffy in the evening, the map was again covered with dark marks, and the parish books were on par with the records of the treasury chambers. At the meeting where this picture was unfolded before the elders, no one tried to hide behind words about morality, because the discussion was already about who in which courtyard would breathe tomorrow. Dry lines about near boiling points were added to the water regulations, and the pottery received another order for small jugs with narrow necks, so that they would be easier to hold at the door and not have to be carried across the courtyard. There was also a struggle on the outskirts, only quieter and more persistent. There, by the artificial ponds of the dyers, where the water had long been thick and colorful, it was best to see how myths love foreign smells. That was where the most persistent rumors came from, that it was the looseness of the dyers or the intemperance of the day laborers from the neighboring barracks that attracted the disease. The doctor again consulted the wind charts, the data on the dampers, and the records of the bathhouse guild, where herbs and lime were stored in a statutory cabinet. In the 2 blocks where the dyes flowed into the ditch, sanitary brigades laid wooden boxes to separate the colored water from the general water supply, and at the same time intensified the boiling and processing of the laundry of those caring for the sick. A week later, it became clear. The outbreaks had stopped, and the cheap rumors had lost their power. The report, which listed the dates of the blockages, boiling, and water purity, was written in large print, as if for those who read through fatigue. And it was this large print that cemented a simple equation in the memory. Separating the flows helps. Moral shouts do not. Thus, the myth of physical promiscuity, convenient for foreign powers, once again lost its own game to a document about water. The Duke's Selection Committee, which inspected cities where decrees on abstinence had been used in recent years to replace sanitation, sent a dry note to the Chancellery. It listed the places where such prohibitions had failed to reduce mortality, as well as the measures that coincided with a decline in infection there. Closing gaps, separating drains, boiling, operating baths according to regulations, disciplined storage of coal and lime, and accounting for dampers. The note did not name the guilty or praise the heroes. It did what is difficult to love. It compared. For our city, this paper became like a mirror. It reflected last year's mistakes and this year's clarity, and there was nowhere to retreat from this reflection. Next to the map of the dampers, a simple language version of the charter was also hung on the city wall, a sheet with short points explaining what needed to be done and why. Adults returning from the market would stop for a moment to glance at it, and that was enough. The city developed the habit of understanding things not through slogans, but through facts. However, nothing loves to return as much as former power over other people's bodies. Supporters of the old ways tried to attach an appendix to the charter under the guise of moral recommendations for homes, which contained outdated phrases about restraint as a barrier. This appendix was not approved, not because of a rebellion, but because the auditor, who had gone through hundreds of lines of expenses, asked only one question: what specific work would the money allocated in the appendix be spent on? There was no answer, because it was not required by those who were accustomed to taking when the word order was loudly proclaimed. The project was quietly, almost politely, but with the same harsh clarity with which a rotten board is removed from a dam to prevent water from flowing where it should not, withdrawn. This moment, not theatrical, but businesslike, became the final, tiny turning point. Control over the purse returned to business, not to posturing. In the fall, the doctor visited the infirmary in the port, the very one whose methods the city had learned so much from over the winter. There, in the quarantine surveillance log, he found a phrase that struck a chord in our story. Just one line stating that the boiling time should be proportional to the size of the jug and the density of the water. This trifle seemed almost ridiculous after 1,000 difficult days, but it made sense. A reminder that even a well-established procedure from the water charter requires attention to detail. Upon his return, he supplemented the city memo with a table explaining in simple terms how to calculate the time if the jug is large and the water is taken from a well, which warms up in summer. At the market, where in August it smelled of dust and warm flour. People began to discuss this table as they had previously discussed loud posters, and it was a sign of a final change. Conversations about the city became conversations about things that were not shameful to hold in your hands. The small claims court, which kept the books of fines from previous years, did what no one expected it to do. It announced a review of old cases where money had been collected for moral violations that occurred during the days when sanitation work was disrupted. It was impossible to return everything to the past. There were too many vague receipts, too many names that now barely make ends meet. But the court nevertheless opened a path of practical compromises. Credit in favor of adult families who worked in sanitation brigades, a discount on waste removal for workshops that voluntarily opened underground passages and paid for their elimination, and the right to demand that a neighboring workshop participate in paying for the frames if its drains went into a common ditch. This accounting fairness looked like a long gray ribbon, but it supported hundreds of courtyards where people had to choose between verbal humiliation and hard work at night. Now, this work did not bring fame, but it did bring respect in the budget. When the memory of the long-ago Black Death of previous generations came back, the chronicler leafed through old books where someone had written notes in the margins about the mercy of abstinence. He wrote new words in pencil next to them: the mercy of boiling, the mercy of a closed crack, the mercy of clear water at the threshold. These phrases didn't sound pretty, but they made life more comfortable. The water charter, signed by those who were used to being responsible for stone and steam, had become ingrained in the city like the steps of a staircase. No one praises them and few notice them, but without them, it is impossible to climb to the floor where it is quieter to breathe. There were no longer any posters in the square urging people to keep their fear in bed. There were maps, revision schedules, and brief explanations of why this Tuesday the bathhouse was operating on a special schedule for those caring for the sick. Adults passed by and saw that their lives had not become holier or dirtier, but simpler. As soon as the cracks were closed and the water boiled, the myths lost their voice. And yet this story would be incomplete if it ended with beautiful, smooth lines. There is no smoothness in the city. There are people who, after 2 years of calculations, still want the easy way out. There are days when the lime cart gets stuck in a ravine and the doctor's students catch colds from sleeping at the dampers. There are bosses who want to reap quick rewards while no one is arguing. It is for these days that 2 folders were left in the office. One with the old maps, with flashes near the old cracks. The other with new lists of closures and boils that coincided with the decline. Anyone who tries to drag the city back into supervision in the bedrooms will come up against these sheets. Anyone who forgets why a bathhouse in the charter is not a luxury, but a tool, will come across a list that clearly states how many times the boilers have broken the chain of funerals. This is our final nerve. On the table of power lie not curses or vows, but evidence. It is not customary to read them aloud in the square, but they are convenient for closing the gaps, the very ones through which not only water enters the city, but also foreign power, under the guise of care. When the doctor took his cards at the end of the 2nd year and tied them with string, he did not think he had won. He simply saw that the city had finally learned to recognize its illness, not by the image of sin, but by the root of water. And this knowledge became the only thing that did not need to be embellished. The ducal decree, which enshrined the water charter and abolished all interventions in bed, under the pretext of morality during epidemics, looked dry. Lists, references to articles, signatures, but behind this dryness were adult hands that drove wedges into the night, adult backs that carried frames, adult eyes that peered into a murky jug and waited for the water to boil. Thus ended not a legend, but a habit of replacing hard work with loud fear. And if a new disease comes tomorrow, the city will not start with an order to restrain, but with raising the frame and checking the crack. Because a document without a myth saves, and a myth without a document again and again gives people into the hands of those who love to count other people's sighs more than other people's water.